of my love to you. When I call your name, just like me. When I call your name, just like a plea. Just because of my love to you. When I call your name, just like me. When I call your name, just like a plea. Just because of my love to you. When I call your name, just like me. When I call your name, just like a plea.
Steel!
Just because of my love to you. When I call your name, just like when I call your name, just like a plea.
Alright. So sorry for the wait. Yo, Fritz, thank you so much. What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. I was letting my dogs outside and they like to take their time. We are going to be discussing stuff today. I'm going to pull up my camera here in just a second. If you are a mid-tier member, someone like Fritz, and you want to join the call, we can figure out how to do that. I haven't done it before, so this is our first podcast that we're going to start, Vodcast rather, that we're going to start doing every Saturday. I'm not really sure of the time yet because everyone's on a different schedule, but it's going to be cool because we're going to be talking about anything and everything that you guys want to know or that you guys are wondering about. I don't think that these are going to be topics that I'm going to be coming up with unless if I have something specific that I want to cover. So if you guys want to leave suggestions or you guys want to talk about certain things, then throw that up in the Discord. There is a section in the Discord that you can do that. And there we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Okay, so we are going to be discussing distortion today. Locked in here, buddy. You can't get out. You just try to like bolt out. So distortion is kind of something that I've been getting asked a lot about whether or not I could cover something like in-depths of Trash 2 and all that. And I'm going to be talking about just anything and everything regarding distortion that you guys want to discuss. I will say that there's this dude called Anti-Negative, and he is the Church of Sound Design, I think, on Discord. I think he's got a server called that, but he streams on Twitch, and he actually had some really good coverage of, of Trash 2 as a whole, over the ins and outs and the in-depths and stuff. So I'm not really going to be talking about like super mathematical things, but I'm going to be talking about kind of what use cases and applications that we can do regarding that. So if you know nothing about distortion, this would probably be a really good place to start. But the only thing that distortion really means is that you're adding harmonics to a sound. So let's go ahead and pull up Faceplant. And if you don't have Faceplant, then you can really use anything. Vital would actually be really good for this too, but I'm really just going to be using a simple sine wave with an oscilloscope. Now, if you look at this, let's go ahead and make this a little bit wider. There we go. And then let's set that to freeze. You can see that right now this is nothing more than a simple sine wave. When you start to add distortion to these kinds of things, you're essentially building harmonics, and harmonics is just going to somewhat start to evolve the waveform. You can also see on here, which is actually kind of cool, that it will kind of give you some kind of indication or replication of what the signal, or like what the signal actually looks like. So you can see here that it's kind of squarifying after we add some simple overdrive. If I were to go here and freeze that, you can see that the sound matches the waveform in that sense. Now, most commonly, distortion is used to make sounds thicker, to sound bigger, to sound heavier, I think, is... Love the preview in Faceplant. Me too. It's really nice, and I like that it's also dynamic, so it's not just like a single picture. If it's moving, like, you'll actually be able to tell, and that's something that's really cool. So whenever you're doing this kind of stuff, you can kind of like just take a look and oh, I'm sorry. Hey, Free Will. I didn't see there. You can kind of take a look, and then you can kind of see that within these things, you're adding more and more distortion on that. So something that I do want to cover, like this is just a super duper basic intro to this, is looking at the different kinds of distortion. And I'm actually going to pull up a Wikipedia for that because I kind of want you all to, and myself as well, to be reminded about just like there's so many different types of distortion, but what really makes the difference between them is usually like just what kind of processing it's doing, if that makes sense. Like you have soft clipping, you have overdrive, which are very similar, if not the same thing. You've got transistor, you've got tube, you've got, man, you've got a lot of different things. Oh my gosh, what else you got? You've got just regular saturation, you've got diode, you've got asymmetric, you've got wave shaping, you've got just so many different kinds of things. So let's go ahead and take a look at and see if we can find all the things to kind of take a look at, so that way we can kind of image that. Fuzz, distortion. Okay, this is a good start. 9 types of distortion, how they're used. I think that they're also like not mentioning that this is like every kind of distortion, but essentially with these different types, they're different kinds of characteristics of that sense. So like with these different forms and whatever, they're going to have a specific sound that you will come to recognize. And it all comes down to what kind of harmonics they add. And that's really what makes the difference between these types. So for example, I'm pretty sure that soft clipping adds odd harmonics, I want to say. It's either odd or even harmonics, and that gives kind of like a warmer sound. Whereas if you add the opposite, again, I'm not sure which one it is, like hard clipping, it's going to make the sound colder and more metallic. So that's kind of where you kind of fall into these kinds of things. So tape saturation is sledgehammer to paintbrush. What? So let's see. It combines transient smoothing compression and soft signal distortion to progressively glue and flatten the signal. So this kind of is just like a subtle means of adding harmonics to that. It's not going to be very crazy. I don't like that this is in pages. That's really annoying. And I don't think that we need to be bombarded with ads on another types of channel. But valve saturation, I've actually never heard it before. That's interesting. Let's see. Now I'm getting a bunch of different stuff. Linear distortion, bandwidth. Wow, these are a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff to look at over here. Acoustic distortion. Wow. So linear altered amplitude content, nonlinear. I like when I learn stuff. This is pretty cool. Okay, so linear distortion is when all audible frequencies are transferred at the same level. A system called linear. Its specific frequencies are output at different levels. The system is distorting with little experience. This can be detected by ear if it exceeds plus or negative 2 dB. And sometimes less depending on the bandwidth of deviation. Linear distortion is more easily perceived as the deviation spread across a wider band of frequencies. The narrower the bandwidth, the amplitude, the range of linear distortion, the better. So over the entire audible spectrum, less than 1.5 decibels is desirable. More than that is like watching TV with dark light spots on in the picture. Okay, so linear distortion in a sense, best I got is live minus 20 seconds at 144p. Are we having stream issues? Wait, are we good? Is anybody here? So with linear distortion, I think that it means that it's going to spread that across evenly through the frequency spectrum. So, or it's going to go all the way up to that specific level. So I think that's kind of another can of worms. But whenever you talk about linear, Lex is having internet issues. Are you having internet issues? So this isn't really all even that important, but basically it just means that it's either taking like the full frequency spectrum or linear, and it's going to spread it out evenly versus a nonlinear EQ, which like on a nonlinear EQ, you have your lower frequencies more spread out, and then as you go up, there's actually more frequencies stacked like closer together between something. So instead of like 0 to 100 hertz, which is this wide, when you get to like 1000 to 10,000 K, you have a much wider frequency distribution in between that. And that's really only important. It's not that it's not important, but in regards to just recognizing how it sounds, like that's kind of covering a completely different topic in that way. And then they're talking about bandwidth distortion, which is only taking a specific frequency of distortion and or like a band in that sense. So HD comes in two forms, symmetrical and asymmetrical. Okay, so that's kind of what we were talking about. So harmonic distortion, ANX, is the addition of related frequencies, whole number multiples of the fundamental, given the fundamental tone of 250 hertz. The second through the fifth harmonic, which would be 500, 750, 100, or 1000, and 1250. Okay, so symmetrical distortion is when you are multiplying the fundamental by harmonics in that way. And it looks like when it's asymmetrical, it's kind of, let me see. That's not even on here. Was that on there? Distortion. Second, third, fourth, less audible. Closer in pitch, more likely. Higher harmonic, lower, very high harmonics. So wait, it only covers harmonic? Oh, okay, so symmetrical is odd harmonics, and then asymmetrical is even harmonics. Hey Harvey, what's going on? And that means that if it's adding like even, then it's going to be the second, fourth, sixth, and then if it's odd, it's going to be the first, third, fifth, such and such, and that just dictates like what harmonic it's actually going to go. And I think like you would describe harmonics in general as just like some kind of division or multiple of the fundamental. And that's why they're talking about if like the fundamental tone is at 250, then when you would add something evenly, then you would double it. If you were to add something like in an odd way, then it would be distributed like by the fundamental frequency in mathematical terms. Does that make sense? Probably not. I'm not a math teacher. I'm also not an audio engineer by any means. Okay, so intermodulation is the interaction of two or more frequencies. So this is really cool because this is like kind of like when they kind of go into each other. And sometimes like if you have certain frequencies stack and they don't phase cancel, then what actually happens is it ends up like boosting the amplitude. It will actually sound like it's getting louder. Take two kicks that are in phase and play them over each other, right? That's actually going to cause it to make it seem like it is actually louder. This is kind of going in and saying that it may produce sidebands of 1100 and 900. Intermodulation adds non-related highly dissonant frequencies that are far more objectionable than harmonic distortion and audible at levels lower than any other non-linear distortion. So music is made up of many simultaneous frequencies, making IM distortion a major concern. It is consistently agreed that IM is more detrimental and other forms than other. Okay, so I actually wanted to talk about this because I think that I've actually heard this term in a different context before, where if you take like a re-space or something and you boost the low mids so hard, I think this is the same thing, but you boost the low so hard, it's actually going to make the high end sound like it's cutting out, like in actual like terms. And so this is something that I actually got from Audica, but if you boost that low end really hard, then it's going to make it seem super thick, and it'll kind of cut that out. So that's kind of like where you get into that, like your low end is so loud that it makes everything else like outrumble the clarity of the sound, and that can actually be useful in certain cases. But obviously like this looks like it's something from like a very like clean mixing thing, and that's where there's so many, that's why the descriptions of these are actually kind of different. This is all stuff that I've looked at before, but it's being the information is being presented to me in a different way. So like 250 to 400 area, I would say like I'd say like 80. Like you boost your sub and your low mids, but then you cut right next to it. But just anything right there of that nature can kind of be on there in that sense. Okay, so dynamic distortion is more amplitude distortion than absolute linearity. So, and we'll talk about this like whenever I hop in the DAW. So we'll look at some of these different things. Like today isn't really like a master class over something. I'm just pulling up information and encouraging a discussion about this. So I want it to be super clear that I'm not trying to act like I know something and that I'm trying to be smart. We're just being like, we're talking about distortion today, and here's a jump off point. So If at any point in time people have stuff that they want to talk about or you have questions, then let's talk about it, because that's kind of what this is supposed to be about. I need to try this. I haven't touched my DAW in months. What are you doing, man? Get in there. Get back in the fight. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so let me see. So the strong spikes, usually from percussion instruments, give live music impact. Soft passages make the loud more impressive. Unfortunately, many recordings have had the highs and lows of the dynamics compressed to a narrow range, and or the transients chopped off by limiters. Sometimes it's done more subtly than by gain writing. Some pop recordings have been highly compressed. There's nothing we can do about it except try to avoid compressed recordings. Good luck. At home, we need to concern ourselves with the playback system's contribution. Thermal compression by the drivers or inadequate power or power handling will steal the dynamic life out of music. The more you compress, the less dynamics you have. Yes. Without the full dynamic contrast and unclipped transient spikes, the music will have lost the quality of live sound. Okay, so I think that this is like talking about if something is... Wait. Amplitude from the softest to loudest levels, the dynamic range. Okay, so I'm not really sure. I think this is what they're talking about. This is the kind of distortion that you get if you're pushing a transient too hard into a clipper or into a limiter. That's what this looks like to me. And so whenever you have a limiter, you're trying to make it as loud as possible without any distortion happening. So the dynamic distortion that's being activated, can you undo some of that with an expander? No, because once it hits the ceiling, or once it hits that threshold, it's cut. It's already activating in that way. You can take that signal and make it louder and quieter after that processing, but you don't get the dynamic, you don't get the cleanliness of the transients back. And I think that's what they're getting at here. That's what that sounds like to me anyways. So yeah, whenever you have like a soft clipper, or whenever you have a limiter, whenever you push a signal into it, it's trying to stay transparent. But once that sound begins to change, that's the kind of distortion I think that they're describing here. So let me see here. Temporal distortion comes in numerous forms. Two related forms are that boosting low NREs definitely cuts out highs. Very interesting. Yeah. You can still bring it back. So you can boost the highs, and then that's like where an OTT would actually become necessary. And that's why a lot of people do that. But whenever you boost the low end in such a way, it gives it kind of like that, right? Which most of us like. But I think that's describing the inner modulation. I can't remember who it was that we talked about this. I want to say it was Data Broth, but it's something that you see me do in almost every single one of my basses. It's something that Frequent actually taught me without describing like this definition. So yeah, temporal distortion comes in numerous forms. Two related forms are phase angle shift and group delay. Group delay is a time lag that varies by frequency. Group delay is not the same as phase distortion, but it results in phase shift. Phase distortion may or may not have a time delay, yet in the end, the effects are similar. So group delay and phase distortion can arise from mechanical or electrical sources. Everything, without exception, starting with the recording process, produces some time phase angle distortion. So fortunately, there are inaudible with music programming even relatively high amounts, so over 1440 degrees, more than 4 cycles of phase shift has been determined inaudible, and so this is more than double the amount of any typical audio system causes. Spares and repeating phase angle distortion is inaudible. Interesting. Okay, so ceilings. Another type of temporal distortion is resonance. This one is critical. Let's call it time dilation because it stretches the signal out for a longer duration than in the recording. In other words, lengthening the decay or ringing. So this would probably be when like you're pushing the resonance factor really high. Drivers with poor damping in cabinets that don't completely absorb or block the internal vibrations of the enclosure into the room. So this is a major contributor to perception of it doesn't sound live, it sounds like speakers. It's measured by the cumulative spectral decay, or CSD. So this might be like this might be like another way to describe feedback. Like let's say the signal is continuously bouncing and it creates a specific resonance that becomes audible over time. I could be way off here, but that's what that sounds like to me. And yeah. Okay, so group delay, phase shift, and resonance distortions also come into play when the sound waves are altered or redirected after the transducer under the control of electrical signal, has produced them. Resonant cavities and various means of controlling dispersion result in alteration of the waveform. It's best to let the transducer disperse the sound without interference. Okay. Noise distortion, broad spectrum frequencies, electrical tape, tape hiss. That one's pretty self-explanatory. You're pretty much adding noise to the signal. Acoustic distortion, modulated, new amplitude, modulated frequency content, not in the original recording. Be compared to noise. That's interesting. Best to have rooms that are neither too lively nor too dead. So this would be like if it's adding to the sound because of the reflections. That's cool. Oh yeah, that's how I used to. That boosting loner. Dang, yeah, that sounds crazy. Mixes to hell because of that. You know what? It's akin to compressing a sample to hell and repeating that compression. That sounds similar to what it does. Yeah, that could be it. Let's see. No matter what, advisable for reflections. Yeah, so this is almost like when the sound becomes louder than it's supposed to be because of the room that you're in. Yeah, the delay gives the ear brain time to distinguish the direct sound effects. So like it's almost like if something sounds like more pressurized. And this is kind of interesting because like these are things that happen to sound in general. We're not really looking at digital distortion as of now, but like this is it's not even for live recordings. Like this isn't something that you would try to record or that you would try to add to your signal. Like this is what happens to a sound when it's being played in real life, which is not really relevant towards, it is relevant, but it's not really relevant towards producing, but it is interesting information to just kind of be like, oh, I never knew that. Mental distortion. What? Okay, so this is like going off the deep end with some of this stuff, but let's go ahead and look at some of the other ones that are a little bit more common. Let me see if I can find types of digital distortion, because that might be a little bit more helpful. Okay, cool. This looks a little bit more concise. It would be for testing on a PA system. Yeah, but even then, I don't think that that's what people would be like super mindful of, right? It's just a phenomenon that happens just because you're playing something in a physical space. So, all right, so clipping is what most people associate with distortion. Is actually the cause of harmonic distortion is the effect. So the fundamental differences in operation, clip differently in tube circuits produce soft clipping when they're saturated with signal, creating a gradual breakup as volume increases. So this is actually the epitome, clipping is the epitome of like the meme bass of like, because what happens is whenever you start adding clipping towards a signal, it starts to squarify everything. And if you have something that has like super high peaks in it and stuff, then it's going to make the sound pretty much like it's breaking, right? So harmonic distortion again comes into even and odd, and then they're talking about clipping. So harmonic distortion would be the difference between soft clipping and hard clipping, because they're specifically dealing with either odd or even harmonics. And to me, I'm pretty sure that's what clipping pretty much does, is you're either adding odd harmonics or you're adding even harmonics to it in that sense. So second order harmonics are numbered multiple of fundamental frequencies in signal, with a simple octave being the most prominent. So since harmonics are always in tune with the notes being played, they tend to lead to pleasing richness in a variety of signals, even complex timbres and dense chords. So if you were to add something that's even, it's going to kind of sound richer, almost like it has like chord tonalities. Not in the sense that you're going to make a chord out of it, but it's almost always going to sound nice in that way. So odd harmonics, they say, are the strongest, being an octave plus a fifth. So that's 19 semitones, I want to say, and which gives harsher or edgier sound prominent rock and metal music. So this is what you would use if you want to make things sound more metallic in that sense, or kind of screechy. So that's kind of that avenue. Total harmonic distortion is measured of the overall distortion added by a device, so the sum of all harmonics present to the compared input. So we've also got saturation. So it's the gradual change in tone when tubes and magnetic tape reach the upper limits of their intended ranges. So back in the day during analog recording and stuff, there was only a certain frequency range that you could record in, and once it kind of passed that, or if anything was recorded that had those different kinds of things, it would pretty much give saturation to that idea. Intermodulation distortion occurs when non-harmonic or subharmonic frequencies appear in signal due to complex relationships between tones. Fuzz pedals can create a significant intermodulation distortion when dissonant intervals are played through them, resulting in a muddy, unintelligible sound. That's my shit. Envelope distortion occurs when the amplitude of a sound is altered over time. So compressors, for example, allow the user to control sounds that have an undesirable result by enhancing sustain and de-emphasizing transients. So we already talked about that. Isn't a square wave all harmonics? I think yes. Yes, but the thing is that whenever you start to introduce that kind of distortion to something, it's an interesting topic, because in essence a soft clipper squarifies something, right? But a true square is only odd harmonics. So let's put that one in our pocket and let's take a look at that, because I think that's a cool place to start whenever we actually get going into doing things. And we'll look at harmonics first, because that will be like the best indicator whenever we're making like wavetables and stuff. So phase distortion is what happens when all parts of a signal's phase is shifted, often as a side effect of electronic circuitry. Multiband equalizers can cause phase distortion when certain frequency bands are processed and others aren't. So phase distortion is probably something that you would get if you're using a dynamic EQ. Noise isn't technically distortion, but rather an addition of unwanted constant to a signal, so that's not really anything. Digital clipping is produced when a signal exceeds the limits of the system transmitting it. Just like analog circuits, digital audio systems have an upper limit of the information they can convey, known as full scale. So when it exceeds 0 dB, it's squared off in a harsh and artificial sounding way. Aliasing is another byproduct of digital audio, so product produced when certain frequencies are interpreted incorrectly. So the audio equivalent of those jagged lines in video games. Aliasing can occur when frequencies below or above the range of a system are not properly filtered out. So some plugins and digital gear feature a function called upsampling, which increases the sample rate before the processing signal. So like this aliasing is pretty much like when you send in a sound to a processor, it's supposed to come out the same. But sometimes whenever you send that in, there's stuff that's read incorrectly, and it ends up coming out not the way that it was intended. And that's pretty much what aliasing is. And they're saying that if you increase the sample rate, or you increase like the, how do you say, it is sample rate, but I'm trying to think of another analogy for this, but when you like pretty much like up the quality of the processor, it's like printing in color. That's a great way to think about it. So you've got this page that you're trying to print and it's in color. Aliasing would be like you've only got black and white. But if you use a color printer, that's like CMYK or something, then when you send that signal through, in theory, it should be printed as intended. That's kind of how I would describe that. And there's also more that this hasn't covered. So there's also tube distortion. There's transistor distortion. There is, let me see some other stuff. I mean, even on here, you've got overdrive, saturate, fold back, which would be, it's a sine wave and then it folds back. Sine distortion, hard clipping, quantization, which is pretty much just like down, which is bit crushing, I'd say pretty much. Or like the curve of quantization makes it seem like that because like it's exponential in that way, so it looks like steps. Let's see what else we have. Saturator is pretty much just fuzz. Phase distortion we already talked about. Do I have serum? Because that would be good to look at too. I think I have serum installed. I hope I do. I do. Okay, good. And that's one like awesome thing about Serum is that they've got so many different kinds of distortion. So tube distortion, diode, which you will see is pretty much just a square. Diode 2, kind of the same thing. So the linear fold is, it's a way that you fold it. Sinoid fold, 0 to square, downsampling asymmetric, rectify, which is pretty much squarifying it as well, X shaper, which is a wave shaper, sine shaper. I wish that these had like visual things. Oh, there you go. Okay, so if you look right here, the more drive that you add to it, it pretty much starts to sign everything in that way. I like that there is a visual to this. Okay, let's go back and look at a linear fold. So this kind of looks like a saw wave to me. Triangle wave rather. You can see that that starts to bend, and that's pretty much what that's doing. Those are the kinds of harmonics that it's adding. So that's a square. Oh, this is a square, but there are peaks to the signal here. Interesting. Stop box. This is just kind of like it's just half a square, half a saw wave. Tape saturation. This is just pretty much for warmth. But there's more. We can also look at something that you might see from addictive drums, because these are actually modeled off of like analog things, which I like looking at. Okay, so you've got crunch, which I don't really think is that important. It's just this particular curve from a wave shaper. You've got zap, which is just a bunch of sine waves, heavy, bit crushing. So you'll see that this is pretty much the same thing as quantization. You can see that it's steppers, and that pretty much just destroys or downsamples it. You've got a tube. You've got a transformer distortion. Air pressure, crunch. I thought there was one more. There should be a transistent one as well. So yeah, those are just different kinds of distortion types, and basically like overarching, like the only thing that you really need to know about this kind of thing is that whatever the distortion type, it's going to add specific kinds of harmonics to the original sound in that way. Now FM and like AM and all that stuff technically are also adding harmonics, but it's the process in which those are adding in which that changes in a certain sense or not, right? Because you're actually taking another source and introducing that from an operator versus like here is just a single stagnant driver that is going to kind of force that into the signal. And I can't really talk about like what the relationship is and like how that goes about, but they are very similar in that way. For example, if I were to add overdrive right here, kind of like this, you can see that that starts to squarify in that way, right? But if I were to take an analog signal, this is going to be a little bit more harsh because it's actually a full-on square. But if I were to do that and start to introduce phase modulation, phase modulation, then this is literally trying to make the signal this in some way. I like to think of FM and PM as like a virus because it tries to insert itself into the original source in that way. But if you look at this, technically it is still adding harmonics to the signal. So it's important to kind of like be able to discern why those are different, but also realize like how they can be similar just in the sense of like what adds distortion in general. If you take the second harmonic, it's also going to change this as well. And now this looks a little bit softer. Pretty interesting. Okay, so let's go back to that original question that we had from before and take a look at a wavetable. So if we were to edit this, a sine wave is a single harmonic. And so if we were to take, let me see here, 1, 2, 2, 3, 5. Hello? 5? 5? Hold on one second. There we go. Okay. So 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. Damn it, sorry. Please. 11, bruh. 13, 15. Wait, is there a way that you can just add harmonic, like just add? Okay, hold on one second. That'll save me a lot of problems. Okay, if we were to squarify this, there we go. Okay, let's take a look at this right here. So this is about as close to a square as you can get. So you've got 1, 3, 5, 7, but it looks like this actually has like a downward slope, kind of like this. So this is also what you would consider to be nonlinear, because like what we were talking about from before, look how spread out this is from 0 to 5 to 10 to 20 to 30 to 50 to 100 to 150 to 200 to 300 to 4. So that's something that you would kind of imagine having the skills to code this. It's all just formulas, right? But you can see here that a regular square wave, and this is pretty symmetrical in that way, is indeed, how do you say, like the odd harmonics over time. Make it sound easy, right? So if we were to take a sine wave and squarify that, that's an interesting relationship, and I'm curious as to why that is, of why a square wave, how does a sine become a square when you add soft clipping to it, when it says that it adds even harmonics? Hey, Electric Mantis, what's going on? So that's really interesting. Now, like, it does squarify it, but at the same time, it doesn't actually like become like a full-on square. But what would happen if we were to, okay, so you can see that's a square. What would happen if we were to take that same sine wave and come on here and add all even harmonics? Is there a way to do that? Oh, interesting. That's something completely different. Let me see, squarify, tilt EQ, disperse. Okay, if I had operator, this would be a lot easier. I don't have operator right now. But doesn't Eskimo mix with all even harmonics or something? I have no idea. That's a good question. Is there a way that you can do... That's why his mixes are so god tier. It's all only even. Is there a way that I can edit this? Normalize fundamentals. I feel like if Data Broth or Glurklunk was here, they would probably be able to tell me how I could do that. Wait, let me see. Sorry, the wavetable editor isn't really my thing that I do in this, but it is kind of cool and interesting just to see if we can do something interesting with that. So triangle, square. Sign. Free draw. Pen tool. Loop. That's cool. I didn't know that you could do that. Sorry. Tangential. Okay. So let's just go ahead and add G-clip now. And we'll take a look at this. So right now there's no clipping happening, but the more that you start to clip this, it's on soft clipping. So let's see what that does. We're going to boost the gain a bit. But you can start to see that it's rounding the signal out. So maybe it's not in the sense that it squarifies it, but it kind of rounds the signal in that way, because I think that if we were to take the softness off of this, then the curves or the corners would be sharper. Yeah, okay, cool. So the more that you, the harder it is, the more that the angles of this start to become more roundish in that way. As you can see. So if we just clip the hell out of that and boost that. And then let's also add a limiter over here. There we go. And that's interesting because now if you look closer, you can also see that there's these little offsets right here. And I'm not really sure if that's the aliasing that we were discussing from before, or if that's something different. But that is kind of important, not important, but interesting to take a look at and be mindful of. I don't know if you guys can see that or not, but there are these two like little dots right here that are kind of somewhat cutting that signal in that way. So that's some interesting observations to kind of keep in mind. Yeah, it's imperfect. And so with this aliasing, I think that it's somewhat changing the phase every time, meaning that you're not getting a consistent signal. And this would be important if you're doing this for mixing, but if you bounce this out to audio and it's just that particular sample, then it will be the same every single time. And I think that's been the big argument behind stuff like OTT and all that, is like, if you just have an OTT on like a live MIDI track or on your master or something, then every time you listen to it, it's going to be slightly different, and that can cause problems. To what degree or what you're able to notice is something to be determined, but once it's printed to audio, then it's going to be the exact same waveform every time, right? So I think that's why that can be kind of particular or important to just be mindful of in that way. And the more that you move into that square territory, the more that that seems to kind of even itself out. Yeah, I was just checking to see if there was some DC offset there. And DC offset, if you didn't know, is like right now the distance between the top and bottom sign of the phase line, it's called something else, but is even. So the amplitude distance between those two channels, or those two things, are even. But if you had DC offset, then like this would be right here, and then this would be either like way lower or way higher, and it would look all weird and messed up. But ideally, if your DC is in line with itself, then no matter what the waveform looks like, the distance between up here to the middle and down here to the middle is always going to be consistent in that way. Just interesting stuff. So yeah, there's that aspect of it. But like, what does all this stuff even really mean? Like, why is this stuff important in the first place? Well, the most important thing that I would say is that learning the types of distortion are going to give you the specific characteristics in order to, do sound design and whatnot. And I think that a lot of times we have an affinity towards something specific. So if I were to pull up Trash 2, which is one of the biggest reasons why I like Trash 2, is it's literally one of the most flexible types of distortion that you can have. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's remotely close to this other than a wave shaper on its own. Yeah, I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. The closest that I would recommend, which is actually free, is Melda Wave Shaper. I don't know if that has multiband or not. I don't think so, but it's not really all that necessary, but it's fine. So pretty much all this stuff here, like within these presets and all that, are just curves or just shapes. And these are all specifically like different kinds of distortion that you can add to your, I guess like that you can start to add to your original sound, right? So even with something like mirror overdrive, well, this is kind of important to know as you learn these key terms because it has the term overdrive in it. And what is overdrive? It's clipping, right? So you can see that this is some amalgamation of a soft clipper. So we can kind of tell that this is going to be adding, supposedly, according to the definitions that we were just looking at, that it's going to be adding some instance of what's it called? Some instance of even harmonic additions, if that's the way that you like to look at things. You can always create your own multiband configs. No shot, dang. No shot? Hold on one second. So, I mean, on paper, that's mathematical, you know, hocus pocus and stuff, and I'm more interested in the application aspect of it. But in theory, if you were to just take a sine wave and you were to add overdrive to it, then theoretically it should start to round things out, right? So if we take a look at this, it's starting to round things out. That's not quite a square, but getting closer to it. Let's add a little bit more. And you can start to see that this curve is going to start becoming more sharp as we add more drive to it. Now, that sounds more squared, right? Look at that shape. That's interesting. Hey, Vortex. What's the sad face about? So this looks like some kind of weird twisted square, which looks cool, but that's kind of what's happening in that sense. Really, like, this is just something to kind of pay attention to see if you like it or not, but yeah, it starts to give out that shape. So let's go ahead and take a look at the smooth overdrive instead, reset these parameters and see what that looks like. This one's a little bit more subtle and the curves are a little bit smoother. Again, as you start to add more drive, you can start to see that it's doing almost the same thing as mirror drive, but you can still see that there's that softness on there, and that's why it doesn't sound as harsh. So whenever you're shaping characteristics and tonalities and timbres and all that, if you want something that's smoother, then you're generally going to start reaching for a specific kind of distortion, right? If you want something that's harder, you're going to start to reach for something different. But with the wave shaper, all that's like fine and dandy and stuff, but the wave shaper is one of my favorites. And the reason why is because you can start to create like your own stuff. And the way that trash works in general is that it'll give you like an overall starting curve, but there's more information beyond the curve that this is giving us. You read two reply comments to my original comment. All Melda plugs have multiband. The free versions don't though, before continuing on with the stream. Yes. The only thing that I saw was all Melda plugins have multiband, but I didn't see that you had a description there. I'm on live chat right now, but if you look right here, I don't know if you typed that in or not, but I was just reading what I saw. So sorry if I missed it, but I don't know. So, hey Kyle. Yeah, so what you can do is you can actually take a starting waveform like this, focus on this quadrant right here, and you can start to create your own shapes. The way that I like to, that I'm pretty sure that this works, is that the loud sounds are over here and the more quiet sounds are over here. And so when you start to create these curves, you can basically take this and push up the quiet sounds, and then this can kind of start to do something different to like the louder sounds of the thing or whatever. So for example, this is going to be loud, by the way. Take a listen. And I added the free caveat just now. Okay. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just lots of juggling thoughts, right? But you can start to see here that by manipulating the quiet parts of the sound within this curve, you're starting to get a lot more crazy stuff. And keep in mind too that this is just a sine wave that we're messing with. So if you were to take that idea and then go into stage 2 and pull up something different like tape saturation, and then kind of do the same thing, then all of a sudden you're starting to get stuff that's just... Yo, see ya, Harvey. This VOD will be public, so have fun with it. Or don't worry about missing out. Unless if you have questions, that would be something that is different. But what's cool is that like you can also take this into the other quadrants as well, right? In this sense. Or you can focus on all of these, and this looks like it's symmetrical, but I think I want to say that like you can actually make this different, I think. So if we were to focus on this part right here and take whatever's in here, then I do think that you can manipulate that. Okay, no, it's still symmetric. Oh, you have to do bipolar mode. Okay, yeah, sorry. So you can actually take what's over here on positive negative value and really just fuck shit up. The closer to the lower left you manipulate, the brighter. A gentle curve at the top right. Yeah. You can also add in linear tension, squarified triangle, sine stuff right here, but I wouldn't really mess with that. But as you can tell, there's a lot of stuff that you can do just by like really shaping the waveform and whatnot on this manner. So you can really get down and dirty with doing this stuff, but it's all kind of on a waveform type line. So it only moves from left to right. Bro, my brain literally has been tuning out the second distortion stage of Trash 2 for like half of a year using it now. So you can start to see that just by creating shapes in this way, like there's a lot that you can do to manipulate the sound. Now this is all cool and stuff, but it's just towards... Sorry, I wanted to see if this was actually replicating what this was supposed to be doing. And it looks similar, but I don't think it's actually quite the same thing. Really, like, you can do all that stuff, but for me personally, kind of like what Kyle was saying, I really just focus on the top quadrant here. And if you, again, kind of mess with this area, especially when you have stuff that has more harmonics, then you're going to get some crazy shit. So... Okay, well, that's kind of cool. But now let's pull up something that's like an actual neurobass or whatever, or something that actually has more harmonics in it. So this is just bloop-a-doop. And this is what I was doing last night to have some fun. But by itself, it sounds like this. Now, I will say that like once you introduce the other macros and all that, the sound will get more complicated. But just as a starting sound, then we can start with something like that. I think the fact you're multiplying your shape with a soft clipper shape is making the waveform nuts. Wait. I think the fact that you're multiplying your shape with a soft clipper... Oh, you mean from the smooth overdrive curve. Okay, yeah, gotcha. You're right. So now that we have that, once we start to introduce something like this, then we end up getting sounds like this. Yeah, sorry, I had to like think about what you were saying at first. That's all because of this little curve right here. If you were to take that off... Sorry, let me go back here to remove and restart. Then we have the initial starting curve from here, from the smooth overdrive. Let me go to reset and just start with this. So if we were to kind of do something general right here, then this area right here would be what's going to beef the sound up the most. Again, if I were to pull this down, you can still see here that it's not really doing a whole lot. So taking something like this, pull this back down. And you can even focus on just like specific areas too. So let me go to reset one more time. And again, just kind of come down here like this. This looks like Fruity Wave Shaper. Not sure if it's the same though. Well, I mean, all wave shapers pretty much, like, if they have the graph, then they do work in the same way. So whatever shapes I'm making right now, like, it'll give you the same results, because the graph itself, because the graphic itself works on, like, I want to say that the left side is the quiet parts of the sound, and the right side is the louder parts of the sound. And so the more that you kind of destroy the quieter parts of the sound, the more that it starts to just, well, sound wrecked. So you can see that by pretty much doing that, you just get some crazy freaking stuff. And so again, if we kind of focus on like creating something right here or whatever, then that's how you end up getting just, hold on, wait a second. It's an input-output graph. Which is why these plugins have a pre-nub. So, you know, imagine like throwing something that is like, this is pretty stagnant, but once you start to change that up a bit and like you introduce things that are like generators and all that, then like just think of the possibilities that you can get, even from just like, yeah. I feel like that should have been like, beep, 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 what the fuck? But you can start to see, right, that by like pushing it through and like really over distorting things in that manner can really kind of give you that just whatever the fuck this was. So in general, if you really want to go forth with distorting things in that way, like there's only so far that you can get before the sound starts to break and all that, but I guess we're kind of just looking at the possibilities that you can create whenever you're putting some kind of insert with this. But the thing is too that you might want to try to do is like, distortion is one thing, but distortion also has a relationship to like other effects. Like an EQ would be a great example. So, and like you would have to do it on a more subtle level. So like, let me just turn this off because I kind of want to play with that for a bit. But, and I'll bounce some of this stuff out and throw it in the Discord for you mid-tier members. It'll be available tomorrow because it has to be cleared by YouTube because I just changed the tier memberships. And then again, just as a quick reminder, if you guys are a mid-member, then you can hop on the call with me if you want to try things or talk about things. But let's grab another instance of trash, and then we're just going to leave that how it is for now. But what we're going to focus on is kind of like what we were talking about with the intermodulation distortion. So if you were to grab this, we're going to go back to the more simple sound. So it's just going to be, right? But if you were to pump this up, the more that you pump the low end on here, the more that it's going to start to like dull out the high end. So can you hear how that starts to get more quiet? So something that you can do is kind of grab something like this and just kind of notch out right next to it. Or maybe even pick a harmonic, because like, and these are a few harmonics right here, but there's like you can see that there's these humps, and so you can take out the one that's right next to it, or you can take out the third, or you can take out this one, or all of them, or whatever. But most of the time within a sound, like if it's pretty simple, like you'll have those kinds of things and you can pick that to EQ or whatever. But if you were to push that EQ, maybe we'll do this with a couple of other harmonics or so. And maybe let's make that one a notch. Okay, so now when you push that through the distortion, there will be a relationship between that will sound a lot different. So that's what that sounds like right now. I'm not going for anything specific. I'm just trying to like figure out how I can dramatize the change of sound the most. So bear with me. But if I were to pull the EQ off now, it's way different. So yes, we are boosting this and we are making that dramatic in that way, but even still, it's always like this, there will be a relationship, and that's the only thing that I'm really trying to prove with that point. I know that that's super boosted, but even in still, like, it's important to know, because whenever you're designing basses and all that, if you're going for something specific, then these are types of things that are going to help people. Like, how do I make my basses huge? Well, you gotta destroy it, right? Because by themselves, right, if this is being boosted super wide by itself, then you get that. If you turn that off and you only use the distortion, then you get this. If you do both, then you get this, right? And so maybe you can even start to focus on thinking about how you use that in terms of filtering, because if I were to take a filter of that sense, and there's a mod on this, so it's already going to move on its own, so that's why it's going to do what it's going to do. But take a listen to this. What happens if you do a couple? Maybe even 3. And something that you should keep in mind too is like where this is cutting, because right now what's actually happening between the Pro Q and the saturation is that this is catching that boosted signal from the EQ band the most. So if you filter that area right here, then that's where it's going to be the most dramatic, because right now you can see that the blue is still floating over here in La La Land. Same thing, well, this one is actually doing a little bit more. But if I were to, let me take this one off and be a little bit more specific, and then maybe I can turn these other ones off too. But right now I'm just focused on cutting that area that's being affected between those two, and you can kind of see how that's changing it in the morphing of the sound. Whereas if I were to cut somewhere over here, you can't even tell the difference. I love distorting something with a strong fundamental like this and then high passing it. For me personally, like, I like to leave the original character as much as possible. So like I wouldn't want to replace this with the sub. And what I usually try to end up doing, and that's why my mixes are usually a lot more rough anyways, is you compress the shit out of it. And then you you compress it, and really what you try to do is just to remove all the dynamics as much as possible to make it flat. And right now we're talking specifically just on a dynamic level, like not necessarily stereo or anything, but when you do something like that, so let's say we've got whatever's happening here, which that sounds pretty cool. You would take something like the glue, compress it. Now it's a little bit more consistent in that way, and then that's why the glue compressor is so prominent, because the makeup gain, well, for this it's a little bit different than Ableton. It's not, but it is. But the makeup gain, whenever you have the peak clip, if you go up to 20 dB, then it's actually doing soft clipping, so that will round everything out. Versus you can kind of hear it. There's a lot of crazy things that are happening without that compression in that aspect. So when you do clip like that, then, you know, then it will kind of change it in that way. But let's do another experiment, because like that's kind of like doing both compression and like clipping to a peak. Do I use compressor on individual tracks or only groups? It depends on the sound, but both. I don't really go for one specifically. It's just kind of like what I think would sound better. What I do usually end up doing instead, though, is clipping. So this is kind of like doing a different process. So this isn't doing compression, but what we're going to do is we're going to clip it without bringing the volume back up. And this is like what an original clipper is. So it's interesting because like on the glue compressor, both with Cytomic and Ableton, they are almost the exact same, except on the Cytomic, the glue, you can push it to hard clip. So you can push it past 20 dB. But between those two, those are different than actual dedicated clippers, because what happens is you push the signal up to clip, whereas on this, you'll see that it'll actually take the signal down. So that's a big difference, and they're essentially performing the same function. It's just what is activating what first, or like what are the conditions in which to trigger the to trigger the effect. Does that make sense? So when you clip something in that way and you pull it down, what it's actually going to do is, I want you to pay attention to the RMS, or sorry, the signal right here. So right now that's at 0. Now let's take a look at what that's at. So the difference in volume perceivably is a very small change, but from clipping, we've actually gained minus 8.4 decibels of headroom. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that because we're not hitting that limit, we could do this. And that makes everything much louder in that way. But even still, when you're clipping, it's actually still like, clipping in its purest form is usually like, I think like it was supposed to be a mixing tool to give you transparency in order to give you more headroom, so that way you could make your tracks louder. There is a certain point that once you start clipping, it will add those means of distortion. But if you want your shit to be loud, this is one way that you can do that. Does anybody remember the motto of 2020? Clip it and limit. So in that sense, you can still use distortion to your advantage in that way, because even though this is somewhat distorting this, you're still gaining headroom in order to do that. So regardless of whatever it is, if you're making a wall of sound or whatever, like there's a lot of different options that you can do in which to kind of, well, achieve something like this without having to have all the ideas of like doing crazy like automation neuro basses and stuff like that. If you just want a loud ass bass, then it's really just a matter of like being creative with how you apply that said distortion. So if you're in FL Studio, then you already have an advantage, because you can just use stuff like Fruity Wave Shaper. But Trash goes on sale all the time for like 29 bucks, and it really is, to me, like the most versatile tool that you can have. I can't really think of a better distortion plugin that's even close to being on par with Trash. And that's not even like in the sense of like all the other stuff that it can do, which I don't really use because I don't really care about it. I've done it, but just in the sense of having this multi-band wave shaper in that way, and plus the presets are really nice, kind of makes it worth the money on its own. So yeah, we kind of like started off in a weird place where we were kind of just looking at other kinds of like weird, like natural distortion phenomena of like what happens like when a sound is reflected and all that stuff, and we were in like La La Land. But I kind of wanted to just talk about like what makes distortion different, or like what dictates different kinds of distortion, and then like how like creative strategies to apply just making really cool sounds. And the other thing too is that like once you kind of have the gist of something like this, you can really start to go crazy with repeating patterns. And that's why in a lot of neuro-based stuff, you'll see that it will be distort, filter, EQ, distort, filter, EQ, distort, filter, EQ, and or sometimes compression. Because you'll notice that the changes over time between like the EQ or the filter or something in conjunction with the distortion creates a specific characteristic. And then once you have that, you take that idea and you build off of that. So, you know, let's say I wanted to, I'm just going to use like a really quick example right here, okay? But I'm going to keep this filter on. I'm going to delete this one, and then I'm going to move the first Trash over. But let's say we've got some EQ where where we're doing this, and then we've got that filtering that's happening somewhere right here. Let's go ahead and just add like a really nice, easy randomizer that's going to be kind of floating around that low mid region, or that, I guess, low region, because it's still sub frequency. And so this is what this would sound like. I'm going to pull the limiter back down because we don't need to make another example of that. But so we've created this aspect now. Now what we can do is, like, we've cut sounds away, brought some of it back. We can go into more filtering from the overall signal. And now this is just again a notch filter, but now this is going to do like other things that will be cutting from the sum of whatever we have right here. So what I would even do in order to kind of help you keep this in mind would be like stage 1, right? So let me see here. So if you were to, come on now. So stage 1 is we did EQ, filter, distortion, and then you get into stage 2, which is filter, and then we'll get into distortion. So we'll group this. I don't know how this is going to sound yet, and I'll change it to make it sound somewhat a little bit more fitting, but you've got stage 2. Which sounds very different. So let's say we really like what that's doing, but we want to control that more. We actually want to put that into like an overall, like, actual usable thing. Well, now that we've got that kind of timbre, what we can do is we can start to actually focus on creating, we can actually focus on creating like an actual movement pattern with that. So now instead of using a randomizer, I'll grab an envelope. You can grab an envelope, like an ADSR, and you can create a phrase with this. T-Rax is nice. I prefer K-Clip 3. I use Rax Clipper, and interesting how G-Clap you pull down instead of applying gain first. I thought most clippers were like that. Like Free Clip is like that. V-Clip is like that. Most of the time, whenever you clip something, you always pull it down first, because that's what it's like. That's what the clipper was always designed to do. Right? Okay, so there's that. Well, maybe we want to do like a multi-stage envelope or something. And right now I'm just using modulators. You can always do this with automation, but here we go. It doesn't really matter. Maybe we can do something like that. And then set that to time mode. So now you're starting to actually create movements from this that are alluding to something musical, right? Because once you have a sound like this, you kind of want to start thinking about creating some kind of pattern or some kind of movement that is going to be satisfactory towards the aesthetic that you're trying to build. Maybe you want this one to be a little bit like kind of... Okay, so there's that aspect. But then you also have the idea of reintroducing movement at the beginning of the signal. I even use the T-Rax version of the glue compressor, and I'm in Ableton. Well, I mean, like, really, it's going to come down to what you like, you know, like the type of clipper, the type of compressor, or whatever doesn't really matter, other than the fact of, do you like it, and does it perform what you want it to do? For example, I feel like EQ8 and sometimes using like Ableton native devices, if you over distort something and then you have high resonances within filters, you'll hear that ringing sound, like the classic Ableton annoying circuit ringing sound. I've made some videos on like mentioning that, and I flippin' hate that. I don't get that in Bitwig. I can recreate it if I really wanted it to, but that's not like a natural thing that you get from that. So that would be a reason why you might want to use like a different EQ or a different effect other than something from stock. But in general, I mean, there's also 1,000 different ways to solve a problem. 9 times out of 10, you can probably get the same result without having to actually use that specific tool, right? But yeah, so now like if you start thinking about introducing like other movements, so whenever I turn this macro on here, this does a lot. It's going to start to move this notch. It's going to start to move everything, not this one, everything within here. So it's going to activate this chain. I'm not going to go through everything because I did it yesterday. It's going to go through, it's going to activate this, and then it's going to activate like the overall low pass filter that goes on at the end. But when you start thinking about doing that and seeing what you can get from this, then you get more complex bass without having to really like overthink it. That's so cool. Let me turn this off for a sec, and then I'm going to turn stage 1 off, and we'll just focus on stage 2 because there's a bunch of distortion and stuff that's already in phase plant. But pretty cool. Turn the low pass filter back on. Bitwig's EQ is amazing. I was on Bitwig for 6 months before going back to Live 11, but yeah, Bitwig's EQ I love. I do love the EQ Plus. It's really good. So like, let's say you like what this is doing, and now you have timbres and stuff that are actually becoming cool. That's why you would go into further processing. So, you know, let's say I wanted to start doing something that's like multi-band or whatever. And this isn't like, I know that we're talking about bass and stuff for the most part, but this can be applied to any kind of sound in general. But I just find that it's the most interesting with bass because that's really like how you get to making all kinds of crazy shit or whatever. That's just what I like to do. That's my music and my artistry. So yeah, if you add in some reverb over to this kinds of distortion or these kinds of distortion and stuff, then you end up getting something that's kind of, hold on one second. Let me pull this off and then maybe make that a little bit wider. So then you end up getting something that sounds like this. So now you've got some stereo information that's happening. We're going to make this a little bit more dramatic by pulling the mix up a bit and then adding a little bit more stereo to this. Okay, now we broke it, but that's okay because I don't really care. I'm not really trying to make the dopest sound ever. It's not really what I'm here for, but yeah, so now, but what I'm saying is like now that you've created this, you've gotten to this part, you can start to manipulate like, or change where that is. Like maybe we even want to bring stage 1 over here after stage 2, turn that back on, and now we can see what that does. Maybe we want to pull the multiband split before stage 1, and now we're going to send that through more distortion and see what that does when it interacts with both the chorus, the ensemble, and the reverb. Okay, well, just to be cheeky, let's go ahead and add a little bit more tail to this and see what it does. Sorry. Okay, now let's try to maybe move this over and see what this does. Let's pull this to the mid band and see what that does, because we were pretty much focusing on like the highs, and that wasn't really doing a whole lot because the highs don't really come up that much. ROM is my go-to I love ROM. It's so good. Let's pull that over here. Yeah, so you can kind of see that just like there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can get into with using the idea of distortion, but the kind of thing that I wanted to bring about with this was just, for one, like giving you a general idea about just kind of what it is. This isn't like a comprehensive thing about it or whatnot, because there's actually a lot of distortion that I still have a lot to learn about myself. But if you can kind of understand that the shapes of distortion, which is really what it comes down to, is just specific shapes, give your sound a particular characteristic, and then learning how to apply that in different places and different stages, and like the ins and outs of why you would do something beyond just distortion, of like distort, EQ, filter, or, and this is kind of just regarding bass, but in that sense, you can kind of see that like you find, especially within electronic music or experimental electronic music and stuff, and today we went through the like super extremes of all this, but you can kind of see that's why it's important to look beyond the effect itself. So it's not you put this on, it's 2 clicks and it's done. It's like, no, you use that in a sense to stack. Like for me, like even with that analogy, like if I were to use something like the drip, I wouldn't just put 1 on. I'd put like 5 or 6 on and see how I can make that change over time. And that's where you're going to get the most dramatic results. It's where you're going to have the most versatility, within the sounds and stuff that you create. So yeah, does anybody else have anything that they want to talk about with distortion and stuff? I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to bounce out a cool little, some cool little hits or whatever, and then throw that up for the members in the Discord. Sprinkle it in at each stage. Yeah, like if you take a look, so like my patches are designed on phase, whatever. My patches are designed on phase plant to kind of be like one and done for that reason. Good mentioning, if you're on there, there's a wave shaper available in Citrus via the filter section. That's cool. I didn't know that. But after all this, right, I would say that I'm kind of doing super compression or whatever, but after all this I use a little bit more distortion, and like that's just a way that you can, like, if you do heavy filtering, then a lot of times it's very sensible to add in just a little bit more distortion, because whatever you cut, it's going to give it a little, it's going to give a little bit back. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. But yeah, so like whenever I do patches and phase plant and all that stuff, like the way that I try to design these is to pretty much do everything that I just did on that chain all on here, so that way it's just one patch, and that way I don't have to do a lot of stuff on the external, or I can. I have the option to, right? But within all this stuff, like let's just say that I'm just going to do like a neuro-based processing thing with this, then it should be like it's already pretty distorted from like a mild means, if that makes sense. And that's where you get into the idea of amount of taste, right? Because obviously if you just distort something to hell, it's going to sound like what we were just listening to. But if you kind of like know how much of the ingredient to put in, then that's kind of how you develop a sense or like a taste or whatever for like when and where to distort things in general. So for me, like if you're just learning about this stuff, what I would do is I would play Goldilocks. If you're interested in sound design in the first place, go too far. See how extreme you can get, and then start to dial it back. And then once you get that, then pit it up with different effects and see the relationship between how a distortion affects a chorus, how it affects a phaser, and then take those effects and put them before the distortion and see if there's any noticeable change. And then you can start to build your formulas from that. But that, my friends, is that is sound design, is just figuring out combinations of what to add together between what and what. I think because there's so many analog emulations and specific marketing labels for plugins, I get creative blocks where I don't think I'd use things unintended. Well, yeah, I mean, like, the thing is, like, whenever you learn tools or whatever, the whole point is, like, or the most important thing is to figure out what they're for, right? So, like, why, like, what are the functions of this and what does it do? But that's the caveat, is once you learn a structure, then you can learn how to break it. And that is with anything that you're trying to learn. That goes way beyond sound design. That goes way beyond just about any kind of skill or any kind of art form that you can learn. There's certain things within an art form that make it what it is. But once you understand how that works, you can insert yourself, or you can make those subtle changes in a way that still keeps the essence of what it is, but makes it unique. And that is like one of the most true ways to learn to shape your expression, I think would be the best way to describe that. Sound with a lot of low end plus distortion is awesome. Sound with a lot of high end plus a little distortion is awesome. It seems like breaking the limits is kind of the point of bass music. It's really not. That's not true either. It depends. That's what it comes down to, is that it depends. Because it comes down to your aesthetic. If you want to sound like Elon more, then distort to flippin' hell. If you want to have something be heavy but still have something melodic, like, you still have to be mindful to make space for the melodic pieces. Or if you want to have a contrast, maybe you have things that are really distorted, and then you have some things that are still kind of clean. Or maybe you're just trying to have something have a lot of beef as possible without it sounding too obnoxious, right? Because too much distortion, obviously, the more that you have, the more obnoxious it gets, which is fun, but maybe that's not what you're going for. Or maybe you're realizing that you want something to be just a little bit more prominent. Then you would add a little bit of distortion in that sense. You know what I mean? So, like, it really depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. But once you learn what it does, then you want to learn your intentions. I think that's a good segue into that idea. Good point. I was thinking like Woolk kind of stuff. Well, most of Woolk's stuff is pretty clean. His more recent stuff is pretty darn distorted. But if you take a listen to, like, oh crap, what was that EP? It's the one with Sacrifice. Really awesome music, regardless of what he makes. I love all of his tunes. But there's a very clean aspect to the IDM and stuff that he does, right? At least his older stuff. His older released stuff that you can listen to on, like, Spotify and all that. But even still, like, he does still use distortion and things of that nature, but it's to a point that has, like, that fits a specific aesthetic that he's trying to convey. With his more recent stuff, I don't know if you've heard his pre-released EP that, I don't know if it came out or not, but it's pretty darn heavy, and he was experimenting more with those kinds of things. For me, the latest music that I put out, or the last two EPs that I put out, were very crunched and distorted and broken and stuff, but that's because I enjoy that kind of aesthetic. It creates a visceral vibe that in some cases might even, like, it's very technical, but can in some cases seem very primal in that way, because it brings out that emotion, or that raw emotion that is present. So again, it all kind of comes down to whatever it is that you're trying to do. But once you understand the tool itself, then you can understand how to manipulate it in that way. Yeah, the only other thing that I can think of, like, to kind of reiterate that is, like, in martial arts, whenever we teach a punch, we teach it this way. But once you understand how a punch works, you understand the mechanics of it, then you can do it this way, 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 you can do it here. You know, if you really wanted to, you could do this. I wouldn't recommend that one, but, you know, but it's still this. It's still the extension. So that's still the same thing. Like, there's different kinds of distortion and they have different nuances and all that, but at the end of the day, it's still categorized within the overarching thing of its distortion. And that's kind of like the message that I'm trying to bring out within something like this. But yeah, I guess what I'm going to do now is just kind of play around a bit, maybe for like 20 minutes or so, and I'm going to bounce out some samples and just try to put some stuff up to have for people that are already mid-tier members. And like I said, it should be available tomorrow, I want to say. But yeah, if there's any other stuff that you want to talk about regarding like distortion or like wins and wheres and highs, or wondering about it, this is the perfect time. We can always revisit this in the future, but today was like the first like official vodcast, because that's not true. It's kind of bringing back the vodcast, because before I used to have other people come in, like guests come in, and we would talk about specific production things, but I kind of wanted to, for one, avoid potential elitism of like, I only want to bring people on that know what they're talking about or whatever, because that really wasn't the point anyways. It was just people that might have something that they wanted to share. But having it in this particular environment, I think is better, because I never know who's there in the chat, and I never know what they're going to say. And I also need to keep in mind that it's a learning environment for me too. Like, I learned some stuff today even just by looking at the very beginning. I was like, oh wow, I learned a lot of shit. But it's still a discussion. That's the point. It's still a discussion between us. It's not me teaching you something. It's here's a topic and let's discuss it, and let's, share information. So I think that this is good, and it's fun for me. It's energizing for me to kind of take a look and be like, what are we learning? Because that's really what I want to do. My philosophy is to start with the source sound that has the harmonics I'm looking for, and then as you add more layers to the mix, I find I need to add extra harmonics to certain sounds. That makes sense. How to use noise with compression distortion but make the air dynamic. Okay, yeah, we can talk about that. Like, that comes into like just focusing on like what you're doing to specific frequencies though, right? So like, let's say we start just with the simple sine wave. And for me, most of the time, whenever I do, believe it or not, like when I actually do patches and stuff, or like when I make crazy basses, I actually start with really simple waveforms and then I add harmonics to them. I do have some where I have FM from a wavetable, but I like to shape from a single harmonic and add over time. But it makes sense to have everything that you want right there and then like manipulate it and stuff. But there's no right or wrong with that in that sense. But if you were to just take a simple sine wave and then you add noise on top of it, you only need a little bit. But once you incorporate distortion, this is where it to come into what you're talking about, Kyle, like the first thing that you want to actually take a look at is the kind of distortion that you're adding. Because we were just looking up some definitions earlier about like what characteristics the distortion types do, but a lot of times people would go for something like saturation or overdrive, because that's what's going to make it seem like it's going to start to break the sound, and that's what gives it that cool, like, that sound in particular. But if we were to take the distortion off of that and add something that's a little bit different, then that's where you're going to start to see how the timbre and stuff is shaped differently. So let's go here. And again, the noise is like, in order for this to work in the first place, the noise needs to interact with another signal. Because if it's just noise by itself, it's just going to stay as noise. So what you're trying to do is just incorporate a little bit of that noise layer into another waveform, and that's what's going to like be a huge contributing factor to that. Hopefully that makes sense. But, if you were to do something like faulty, you can start to see how this is dramatically changing the sound based off of the waves that we're introducing this through. So this kind of has like a nice little like flutter or whatever over the top, and that sounds really freaking cool. So like, let's say like you like this. So what was that? Oh man, Oh, this was harmonic control. Okay, so we'll multiband this and throw harmonic control on these two. And then maybe on the top end, we want it to kind of have that airiness or maybe a little bit more crunch. And so when we go to that, what we would do is reach for a softer saturation type or a softer overdrive, right? Hold on one second. My computer, or sorry, my webcam just went AWOL. Hold on one second. Computer, please. Hi, we're back. Okay, so we can add that saturation now to the top end, and that's going to make it sound a little bit more crunchy. Maybe not. Right. The reason why is because it needs to still, the signal needs to be, okay, the signal needs to be processed together with both the sine wave and the noise, because right now we're just focusing on the noise aspect. That's why that sounds like that. But what if I were to take the bottom one? There's your intermodular distortion. Is that what that was called? So maybe if we take that and remove that band. That makes more sense. Wait, I'm looking that up right now. Is there a third-party erosion called... Wait. Have you guys messed with... There's a third-party erosion. Dude, Fritz, don't buy that. Just use a ring mod. Erosion is a ring mod with an XY interface. It's just a ring mod, dog. Just a ring mod. The modulator is sine oscillator, low pass noise, band pass noise. But erosion is just, yeah, I'll say that again. But erosion is just a ring mod. I would probably use band pass noise. Maybe low pass noise. Let me take this off. Let's go back to this one. Go here. Ring mod doesn't sound as good. I've messed with both for hours. A being, you can get pretty close though. I disagree. It's just how you apply it. So like what I would do is I'd go back to here and then I would go distortion. And then I'd come in here and go multipass and only put it on the mid band. So right here, and then go ring mod. Or even just have two bands and just put it on the high band. So this would be noise, and then this would be wide noise, I want to say. Actually, they're both noise, but this would be wide noise. But if you turn that up and then you mess with the frequency... then that's how you can start to manipulate that. But just to be clear, let's go back to this really quick, and let's go to corrosion plugin. And this is actually how I found out that that erosion was a ring mod. But hold on one sec. What is that? Corrosion BST. Yeah. Corrosion, a ring modulator made by HornetNet plugins. So this is the source, and then this is the frequency range. So you have noise, which is what we were just doing, and then you've got a bandpass frequency range along that. So essentially, if you go back into the DAW and we take a look at that ring mod, it's pretty much like it doesn't have the XY graph on here, but with the bandpass, you have the frequency range, and then you have the stereoization on that. I would say that maybe there's a little bit more control with this because you have control over the bandpass size, but other than that, it's the same thing. It is a ring mod, but each is different character depending on the noise and stuff. They're very similar though. I'm just saying the fact, that it's a ring mod. And that's kind of, we touched on that earlier, like every type of effect is going to have a specific characteristic. But in essence, it is the same thing. 'Tis the same thing. So you don't need to go and buy plugins on that aspect. I mean, if like you like the sound of erosion, you can demo it, right? And that's really like what you're into. But yeah, it is the same. It is essentially the same thing. And that's kind of, yeah, it's a good point. And that's exactly why I threw this into multipass, was so that way we can control the bandwidth, or like the area of this in general. Because if you were to just put the ring mod itself on the whole thing, kind of like what we did from before, then it changes the characteristic of the sound. Okay, that's a sine oscillator, but if you went to something like bandpass, then you can see that it just kind of sounds like noise. And that's not all that interesting. So that's why I would go and like put that into just a specific space with that. But yeah, like I said, it is just a ring mod. That's actually pretty cool. And then let's say like you have the characteristic that you want or something. That's why you would go into more distortion. If you want it to be more crispy, then you can kind of manipulate that, and then the frequency range of which is activating it. Maybe we can go into something like low pass noise. And then you can just, again, maybe distort the hell out of the high end. But you can still see that, like, between this in general, like, you're getting a bunch of different timbral sounds between all that. And that's why it's important to kind of know how to control that, to, like, figure out exactly what you're doing. Like, one thing that I would advise against, though, is, like, sitting there for hours listening to a song that has a similar kind of sound that you're trying to make, and then trying to get it exactly right. That's like a quick way to insanity. But just know that like you can control that in that way. Just instead of listening to that, find something that you like and use that instead. That's like one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give you. But I mean, yeah, if I were to go into like a project or something to Sounds like we could just layer in noise for a similar effect. Sort of. Oh, right. And then it also depends on the kind of noise that you use, which I forgot to mention as well. So if you just go back to the original right here, like it's not just noise, it's also the kind of noise that you use. And also like if there's stereo in that. So, right, there's that, but then you can also make this wider. Then you throw it through that ring mod. Then let's say you wanted to do a different kind of distortion where you wanted to do something like something that you would also want to keep in mind too is that right, I forgot to mention this because it's not really related to distortion, but this is going to change a lot as well. If you use a filter, specifically a notch, check out how this is going to change the sound dramatically. Sorry I forgot about this, but take a listen. Sounds like we're just writing prompts. Just any FYI, if you ended up getting it, make sure to use the VST2, not VST3. I've had issues with it crashing. Bathymetric made erosion clone in the grid too with ring mods. Copy, that's unfortunate. Bathymetrics is GOAT. So you can see here that if we kind of do the reverse thing that we were talking about of the intermodular distortion or whatever. Basically, let's just keep it in English and remove the low mids, then this will actually give you an interesting sound. So that way you just have a really strong fundamental, and then that way it kind of leaves open interpretation for the rest of the high end on that. And then whenever you go back and you start messing with this, it's going to but I'm pretty sure that you can tell how that's starting to affect that. And then again, once you change like where this is, it's gonna, well, do stuff. So yeah, in regards to making, you know, fart basses, that's the having, you'll see in almost every neurobase tutorial that you cut the low mids, even though you boost the heck out of them in like the design process, but that's why. Also, you can use the XY pad modulator with ring mod if you want it to have a similar feel. Yeah, I guess what would you do? You would, I listed like, let's say you put the ring mod on something like Bitwig. I think you would have the frequency, maybe the bias or so. Well, you could do anything, it doesn't really matter, but I don't think that you can actually like replicate. The thing that is kind of unique about erosion and corrosion is that with the bandpass you can modulate the size of the bandpass, where on this I don't think that you can. Positive bias, yeah, but you do have rectification and bias that you can introduce, and also spread, so there's that. Frequency rather than mix, do it parallel with mix at 100. It'd still be different. Like, you're not wrong, you totally could, but it would still be different just because of the bandwidth. You can't control that in most other ring mods, so that is like a specific thing. But yeah, so, and then you can just boost the high end on this or something. And then that's how you kind of get that airy sound. And then let's say you wanted to make it wide, then you just add something like a Haas effect or whatever. Sorry, I just got ASMR. And then suddenly you've got that really solid fundamental, and you can use that to have just a little bit of wideness within that. But something that you can also consider is like maybe instead of having it be the way that it is right here, you can also use another ring mod to start to control what you want to do as far as like making it like start to turn and twist. I feel like the only time I'd use this is for my highs, so with the width of the bandpass it wouldn't matter much. I could just EQ what I want. But you would go back to maybe a sine oscillator here, and then you can control and do something like that. So and that's why it's important to know the difference between doing something with the sine oscillator or trying to do it with a noise or something, because you're going to get different timbres and characteristics with that. And then if you want to make that more dramatic, then you can also insert more noise. And you can even key track that, I guess, if you wanted to do more with that, but I wish that you could go below 10 hertz on that, because that would make that really cool. Very helpful. Yeah, for sure. So I guess we somehow end up getting into the airiness of how to make a sine noise base. But in that sense, like that's why it's important to understand the relationship between all the effects and all that you're doing. Yeah. So that's kind of that. Make drop out of just noise, then you just use rhythm. If that's what you're gonna do, you just go like just fart in a microphone, boom, finished. But what about the acoustic distortion that you get? It changes things. No, I'm kidding. All right, let's save this as so I'll toss this in the members area if you guys want this preset. Yeah, sounds pretty cool. Anything else regarding distortion that you guys want to discuss, or any questions? You just hold it tighter. That just makes it more squeaky. No, you would have to put a piece of paper in the that's the only way to do it. So you need to have a piece of paper to make it go. Actually, do I have a piece of paper somewhere? I don't, but that is funny. Didn't Noise do that a long time ago? They put a sub and they taped like a piece of paper on the they put a piece of paper on the speaker, and then whenever it played, it pretty much did that. That'd actually be a really fun experiment to do, but I don't have anything that's light enough. Yeah, for that. What the fuck? Laughing my ass off. I'm just, that's how you do it, man. I don't know. That's, yeah. Anyways, I don't really have anything else for this, guys. I think that we pretty much covered everything that we had to talk about on distortion, but you can always kind of continue this, or we can talk about more stuff in the Discord if you have more discussion ideas. But yeah, I don't really know what we're going to be talking about next week, but would definitely appreciate if you guys could like the channel and stuff, and be a guest. Stick a kazoo in the back. Okay, let's not take this too far. I already crossed too many boundaries. But yeah, I don't really have anything else. I think I'm gonna go, guys. Tomorrow I will be playing some Monster Hunter, and then Monday or Tuesday I'll be trying to get some tricking clips up. So if you can, take a look at the post that I made on the community channel, and just be aware of all that stuff. But if you guys have other topic ideas, then hop into the Discord and come into, where is it here? Community building, podcast topics. So just come in here and be like, hey, I want to talk about XYZ, and then I'll pick a Saturday or something. It might not be the week after, so give me some time to kind of prepare something like that. But we've got quite a few topics to cover already. But throw it in here and I'll write it down, and so that way we'll always have something to discuss every Saturday. And yeah, that's pretty much what I got. But yeah, guys, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it, and I will see you all later. Goodbye.